Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to get underway. Because of those lights, I can't see any of you, so if you can identify yourself, please, and direct your question to the front.
How will you define the small businesses who are selling assets for retirement purposes? It seems to be a difficult thing to quantify.
Yes, that'll be a matter that'll be decided by the expert tax panel. There are a range of definitions currently in use. We'll get them decide the best one.
So is that a situation that is used anywhere else in the world? That you mentioned a number of other schemes. Is that something that's common?
Each country has their own definition, and that makes sense because each country's economy is different, including the distribution of business size. That's why we'll get the expert panel to review the evidence before making a decision for us.
Question. Parker, I guess. I mean, revenue you expect to get from bringing forward the inclusion of agriculture in the ETS. In order for that to yield revenue for the government, does that mean you'll have to start auctioning permits?
Yes. Effectively, at the moment, there's some doubt that there'll be an international agreement after 2012, and during that period, there's expected to be a hiatus in the international trading of permits, and at that point, this turns into revenue for the government through the auction of permits.
Mr. Goff, given the net additional revenue is basically in the negative for those first 5 years, given how long it takes for a capital gains tax to kick in, would you therefore phase very slowly in your $10 a week tax cut? Would it come in 2 or 3 phases because of the affordability nature of it?
It will be done within the first term of Parliament, probably in 2 phases, but it will be implemented before the next election. What you see from that chart is very clear, that there's a period of time while the capital gains tax beds in. Thereafter, the revenue is very much in the net, and that will of course help us with the sort of challenge we have ahead of us with an ageing population.
So does that mean $2 $5 a week type budgets, does it?
What it will end up, by the end of the first term, you'll get a couple will be getting about $1,000 a year extra in tax cuts.
But what I'm asking is, would you do it over over 2 budgets?
We'll look at the details of that, and to some extent it depends on the level of growth and how quickly we can do it. We'll do it as quickly as possible, but it will certainly be done by the end of the first term.
You're borrowing roughly $2 billion more than National would out to 2017, you accept that?
If you look at the long term of the chart, you will find that this is something that brings in much more revenue over the medium term, and that's because it's not a one-off sale of assets. This is something where we keep our assets, they keep returning the dividends, and the capital gains tax grows over time, in line with actually our ageing population and meeting the extra needs.
But over the next 6 years, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're borrowing about $2 billion more than National.
There'll be the short term where that happens, and the longer term the revenue will be a net gain.
Just to add to that, of course what's important is that we pay net debt down to zero as quickly or more quickly than the current government's budget, so that's purely manageable.
Have you done any assumptions or any work on house prices over, let's say, just 15 years?
I've read a number of reports on that, and those reports generally indicate that this will moderate the rise in house prices, and this will make it easier for people to buy their first home.
What was your experience looking at the Australian model? Do you think it moderated over there?
I heard the economist for the Sydney Morning Herald on the radio the other day, and he said there was a lot of hoopla from the developers about how much damage would be done. He said it didn't come to pass.
Can I add something there? The Savings Working Group, who recently reported to the government, said that if there had been a capital gains tax during the last housing bubble, it would have been half as big. So there's no doubt that over time, a capital gains tax makes it easier for New Zealanders to own their own homes.
This could push rents up though over the midterm, couldn't it?
No, there's no evidence that would occur because there are several effects here. One is the fact that we might see some landlords want to sell on their houses and first home buyers buy them. Overseas the evidence has been quite mixed, and the bottom line is the effects aren't likely to be large either way.
What do you say to those property investors who are saying that the increased cost of the capital gains tax will be absorbed essentially in rents over time?
They claim that about the depreciation allowance, that has not yet come to pass, and it didn't come to pass in other regimes that have brought in a capital gains tax. People are in the property market, rent out their properties at the market rate. That means in Auckland, because there's a shortage at the moment, the rents are going up fast, and a lot of other areas of the country they're going down. with or without that depreciation allowance. It wouldn't be different with a capital gains tax.
So they're wrong. So they're wrong.
Oh, they are a group that's pushing its own self-interest, as they're entitled to do. But it's clear from experience in other countries and from economists in this area that the doomsaying that is claimed in some quarters simply doesn't come to pass.
Is it really credible to have essentially a different tax system for a different province of Canada?
Well, the thing about Canterbury is it's had a very terrible crisis, and it would be simply unfair and inappropriate to begin to apply a CGT to it in these circumstances. So by far the best thing to do is to give them at least a 5-year window to get back on their feet, then to review the situation and bring the CGT in its fair.
You don't think that would distort the market?
If you did it the other way, if you bought them in straight away and it was to come in a year or two, it is possible that Canterbury values will drop, and therefore the starting value for the capital gains tax would be falsely low, and they would be paying too much capital gains tax, and we didn't want to cause that unfairness.
David Parker, when you talk about the need for structural change, but then also obviously most other OECD countries have the capital gains tax, but they have very much the same sort of structural imbalances that we have. So what difference will this policy bring?
Actually, they don't have it as bad as we do. Our net investment position in the world is one of the worst in the world. Sure, Greece and Portugal and I think Hungary are worse off than us and Iceland, but most other countries in the OECD do far better in terms of their balance of net overseas debt and net investment position. I've got no doubt that the manufacturers and exporters are right when they say that the current tax rules disadvantage them, and as a consequence our export sector is not as healthy as it should be, and this will make it better. I've got no doubt about that.
But it doesn't inoculate against another housing bubble, does it? We know that from international experience, it just doesn't stop another housing bubble.
No, it doesn't, but I think I've already said that 50% of the last housing bubble would have been knocked off, according to the Savings Working Group in their report just a couple of months ago.
Every commentator within New Zealand, the Treasury, the Reserve Bank, internationally the IMF and the OECD, says that one of the reasons that our housing bubble went further and longer was because of the nature of our taxation system. You won't prevent rises in house prices going up faster sometimes than others, but you will stop the extremes that our housing market went to, with such damage to our first-home buyers and to our export industry.
It got pretty extreme in the United States, though, didn't it? And they've got a similar looking.
I think for a different cause, and that was the way in which the financial institutions lent and then collapsed.
You had 9 years in office to have done this and didn't. And I'm just wondering how much of this is driven by economic need and how much is driven by the political thing of essentially taking some bold policy in terms of trying to set the agenda for the election.
I think it's a total change in the economic situation. In the 9 years that we had in government, we consistently ran surpluses. There wasn't a need for another form of revenue. The assets that are so important to New Zealanders to retain were never under threat of being put on the block. They are now. Both of those things have changed. That's been an imperative that has driven this policy.
Phil, that said, weren't the policies wrong from a macroeconomic perspective now, with the benefit of hindsight? I mean, they created a situation where we've had 10 years of low par, inadequate growth.
I want to acknowledge this. As Minister of Trade, I thought that it was wrong that a housing boom, an artificial housing boom in Auckland, forced up interest rates, made it harder for every family that wanted to get into their first home, made it harder for our productive industry, and then forced up exchange rates and made it harder again. We've learned from that mistake. I don't believe that you can rule out another such housing boom happening again. That is why this policy is a vital component to moderating any such boom.
So you're saying quite clearly it was a mistake?
I think in those areas it had a damaging impact on first home buyers and on our export industry, and yes, in other circumstances we may have looked at it earlier.
Do you have any views on whether the accommodation supplement, how that interacts with this? Because that is part of the contributor to the housing bubble as well.
Well, that's another issue. We know the accommodation supplement is important to help people meet the cost of rent. We know that it has the unfortunate side effect also of pushing up rents.
You're looking at gaining $3.3 billion through other anti-avoidance measures over the forecast period that we've looked at. How are you going to get that much money, and from what sort of loopholes are you looking at closing?
So yeah, we've outlined that we'll ask the expert panel to look hard at trust law. One of the principles here is that stashing an asset in a trust should not insulate you from paying CGT other than for a primary residence. Of course, the detail we work through, that'll be a significant area of work.
But how can you put a figure on that when you're going to throw it to a group to work out what you're going to look at?
Because we've had experts go across a range of potential sources. Another one is the stock of existing outstanding IRD debt, and estimates being made about how much that could be reduced over time. Another rule of thumb is how much is before the courts in the way of current claims against tax default. So those numbers are an estimate at this stage. They are subject to refinement, and they will be based in part on the work of the expert panel. We think, if anything, they're probably conservative, as are, I might add, the growth assumptions upon which the revenue numbers are based.
Have you shoulder tapped anyone to be or to chair this panel yet?
That might be a little premature, but we'd be looking at key people with experience as tax lawyers, key people from industry, and key people from some of the government departments.
The Bill report suggests, I think, April 2013 for the CGT. Is that because you told them that's when you think it would be most likely?
Well, it takes time to bring the legislation in. We need to work through this. We need to do it. We're doing it once, and we'll do it thoroughly. And we'll give New Zealanders every opportunity to contribute through their submissions in the normal parliamentary process. That I think, will probably be the first likely date that the legislation can take effect.
Just worth noting in that we are committing to use the generic tax policy process, which means that the tax profession will have input into the design even before it goes through a full select committee process. April 2013 will be about as quickly as we can responsibly do it.
Speaking of the tax profession, the Institute for Chartered Accountants said that the abolition of gift duty will result in tax avoidance opportunities, perhaps novel ones appearing. That bill is currently before the House. Are you, what's your approach to the bill, and what are we expecting?
We oppose the abolition of gift duty for that reason, and we're opposing that section of the bill.
There's some
Would you repeal it?
267,000 people
Would you
who are
repeal
going
it
to
if
pay the
elected?
capital gains tax in any year.
Sorry, if I can just take the previous question. Look, we haven't made a final commitment on that, but it's pretty logical that if we oppose the change, we'd probably want to look at changing it back.
There's a concern from some tax professionals that that will in fact make New Zealand even more of a tax haven than it currently is.
Jolly good thing we're bringing in a CGT to start closing some of these loopholes.
And about 267,000 people are going to pay it in any year, according to your numbers. How punishing do you think this could be for you at the ballot box?
I think that most New Zealanders, including the National Party, know in their hearts that this is a tax that is actually necessary for our economy to grow, to move forward and to meet the future needs. People will look at this, and I think if you look at the discussion that's occurred in the last 10 days, they will, as they understand it, also appreciate that this is a change that will be for the good of all New Zealanders. Let me make this point as well. The overwhelming majority of New Zealanders will pay less tax under this program. And for most households, we saw this morning the fastest rising food prices in a very long time. For most households, this will provide real relief against costs that have risen faster than their incomes.